Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. In the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at divination in the ancient world. Last week, we took a deeper dive into the practice of casting lots, and that led to a few passages that reference an object called an ephod and something called teraphim. We also encountered objects called the Urim and Thummim. In those passages, these objects are clearly related to the practice of casting lots, but they seem to be a bit more specific, and they're worth looking at in more detail. So, what was the ephod? What's a teraphim? And what in the world are the Urim and Thummim? In this episode and the next, we'll explore some ideas about what these objects are. And we really tried to get it into one episode, but today we're just going to look at the ephod and the teraphim. Let's see if we can better understand what these things are. The ephod, teraphim, and Urim and Thummim appear several times in the Bible, sometimes together and sometimes independent of one another. We're going to try to disentangle what they are and the various shades of meaning, starting with the ephod first. When we look at the biblical evidence, we see there may be two distinct purposes for this object. Now, first, the ephod was part of the priestly garb. In parts of the Bible that are generally affiliated with the priestly tradition, such as some parts of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, and so on, we see the ephod described as something that is clearly a piece of clothing. In Exodus 28, the ephod is made of gold, colored yarn, and fine linen. It was worn over the top of other garments and seems to be kind of like a smock that's the same front and back. It seems that it was originally made for the high priest to wear, but we see in other passages that priests other than the high priest also wore them. The high priestly ephod in Exodus 28 was made of expensive materials, but other priests wore plain linen ephods. Exodus tells us that a breastplate could be affixed to the front of the ephod. So, it seems that priests wore this sleeveless fabric tunic that may have had some kind of a pocket as part of their priestly uniform, something that denoted them as priests. From biblical texts, the ephod was connected with an oracular function. It held the implements of oracular consultation with God, which again is why it was so closely linked with the priesthood. And this function connects the ephod with the Urim and Thummim, and we'll look at that connection next week. But there's another use of the ephod that seems to be at play, which is an association with cult images. In non-priestly sources, we see the ephod used in such a way that it may be a sacerdotal piece of clothing, or it may be something else. These sources include what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. There are places in these books where the ephod seems to function similarly to or stand in for another sacred object, the Ark of the Covenant. In 1 Samuel 14, Saul asks a priest to bring the Ark of God. He seems to want to consult it as an oracle to determine where his son Jonathan is, but an uproar in the Philistine camp interrupts the priest, and Saul tells him to withdraw his hand. There's a problem, though. The Ark of God, according to 1 Samuel, is at Kiryat Jearim. It stays there until David has it brought into Jerusalem, where he dances in an ephod and is apparently indecent. Saul asks for the ark, and the priest appears to be bringing it. But the sacred object that's actually present in this scene is the ephod. The Hebrew text is aware of this difficulty, and it has added the parenthetical insertion about the ark being with the Israelites. Elsewhere in Samuel, the ephod is what is brought out to consult God in oracular divination, so one would expect the ephod to appear here as well. Saul asks for the ark in order to perform an oracular consultation that is associated with the ephod. There's something similar in 1 Kings 2, where Solomon spares Abiathar's life because he carried the ark of Yahweh before David. But elsewhere in 1 Samuel, Abiathar only carries the ephod before David. Here, the ephod and the ark seem to have a similar function, or they're even used interchangeably. In these passages, the ephod seems to be a kind of case or a small receptacle of some kind that carried sacred or ritual objects rather than an article of clothing. Now, I'll admit that in some places it could be either a piece of clothing or some kind of receptacle. It's the non-clothing use which makes the most sense in passages like Judges 8 and Judges 17. In Judges 8, Gideon makes an ephod. According to that account, 1,700 shekels worth of gold went into the making of the ephod. It says Gideon placed his ephod in his hometown and all Israel worshipped it. Now this may still be an article of clothing, but it seems more likely that it was a shrine. 1,700 shekels of gold is a lot, seemingly far too much for an article of clothing. Later, in Judges 17, a guy named Micah, not the prophet Micah who lived hundreds of years later, makes an ephod worth 1,100 shekels of silver. He then built a shrine or temple, literally a Bet Elohim, or house of the gods, and made an Ephod and Teraphim. Now this is another case where it makes the most sense to see the ephod as a shrine or other sacred object, and it's associated with objects called teraphim. So the next logical question is, what's a teraphim?
The word teraphim appears around 15 times in the Hebrew Bible, and from these references it's pretty clear it was some kind of statuary, an image of some sort. It was clearly manufactured and movable. Rachel steals her father's teraphim and puts them in a saddlebag and then conceals them by sitting on them. In 1 Samuel 19, David's wife and Saul's daughter Michal concealed David's absence by putting a teraphim in David's bed with some goat hair at the head, just like in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Life comes at you fast, Saul. Now, in this case, some people think this is meant to mean the teraphim was basically life-size and the goat hair is meant to disguise David's whole head. Others think the teraphim was kind of a cult mask and their hair concealed that it was just a mask. So the teraphim are roughly anthropoid in shape and could range in size from nearly life-size to small enough to smuggle in a bag. They appear in households, but also in public cultic installations. In public contexts, they are closely associated with the ephod and divinatory practices. So what are these teraphim depicting? And scholars are divided on this between two schools of thought. One view is that they are depictions of deities, and the other is that they are depictions of family gods or dead ancestors. For the second perspective, passages like Zechariah 10:2 say the idols lie and the diviners see visions that lie. The term for diviners is elsewhere used in reference to necromancy and the occult. So these teraphim could be representations of dead ancestors who are meant to relay messages from God from beyond the grave, thus marrying the divinatory association and the statuary. But the idea that they represent gods or protective spirits makes more sense to me. In Judges 18, when Micah says his teraphim was stolen, he calls them his gods which he has made. In Genesis 31, Laban, looking for his lost teraphim, asks why Jacob stole his gods. This is a more straightforward explanation given the evidence in the text. So, we've looked at some possibilities for what the ephod and teraphim are, given what we find in the Bible. But is it possible to know more about these objects? When we look at archaeology, we see both the ephod and the teraphim have interesting parallels. Ephods, or at least ephod-like garments, show up in several places outside the Bible. Due to the nature of fabric and the environment of Syria-Palestine, we don't find many pieces of clothing from that region, so we don't have any preserved ephods from Syria-Palestine. Some parallels have been drawn with Egyptian priestly garments, and there are multiple depictions of Egyptian priests, and it's clear Israelite priests and Egyptian priests had very different uniforms. Egyptian priests wore linen robes and papyrus sandals as they were not supposed to wear fabric derived from animals, like leather. The linen ephod and the linen garb of Egyptian priests have been linked to those worn by Israel's priests. Some Egyptian priests did on occasion wear a leopard skin, and this has been linked functionally with the ephod and the high priest garb, but these links are all pretty tenuous as far as I'm concerned. There are some artifacts from Egypt which are perhaps better connected with the ephod. In fact, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts may have one in their collection. A linen garment found in a tomb at Thebes was donated to the museum in the early 20th century. Its fine location and context suggested to the excavators it was not of Egyptian origin and it was in fact looted from Syria-Palestine in antiquity. Ephods or ephod-like garments were apparently worn at times in Egypt. Reliefs show figures wearing garments that could be ephod-like. From a New Kingdom tomb, we see this relief of a pharaoh wearing what appears to be an ephod. It appears to hang from two straps fastened with a stone or button and a girdle or belt fastened around the middle. According to Josephus, the Israelite ephod left the chest open, which was covered by the breastplate. And this may be seen in other reliefs which show ephod-like garments that are low cut. Additionally, many depictions from Egyptian reliefs showed the use of pectorals, which have been analogized with the breastplate which hung from the priestly ephod. The breastplate of the priest had symbolic significance as the breastplate of judgment, and it was a symbol of how Israel was brought into the presence of Yahweh. Egyptian pectorals, of which we have numerous archaeological examples, didn't have the same symbolic significance. Instead, they seem to have had an apotropaic or protective function for either the living or the dead. In reliefs from Assyria, we see kings like Ashurbanipal and Ashurnasirpal II wearing a rectangular pectoral or breastplate with various decorations on it, which may be analogous to the Egyptian pectorals in the Israelite priest's breastplate. These again seem to have a protective function, more as magical protection than a practical piece of armor. From Ugarit, we find in the Baal cycle that the god Baal seems to reference his clothing, with the word having the consonantal root IPD, localized Ipadu. Elsewhere in Ugaritic texts, we see the word IPD in both plural and singular form, and it seems to refer to an article of clothing, though not much else can be said beyond that. This has parallels in Akkadian literature where apatu is understood as a costly garment, and in Middle Egyptian we find the word spelled LFD or IFD that refers to a weave made of 4-ply or more threads, so again, a piece of clothing. As for the teraphim, both the understandings discussed earlier have some evidence in archaeology. The greatest proponent of the dead ancestors theory, Karl van der Toorn, has cited texts from Nuzi and Imar. He highlights the term Ilanu, which he interprets as household gods. Some of these texts reference disinherited sons no longer having access to these items. They belong to the patriarch of the family. He believes these are cult images of the family gods or family protectors, likely dead ancestors. Another interesting parallel are the Egyptian Shabti figurines. These figurines were originally meant to represent the deceased and ensure that they had bodily integrity. If your mummy was destroyed, your Shabti ensured that you had a body for the afterlife. But by the New Kingdom period, Shabtis were not representations of the deceased, but of their servants and assistants in the afterlife. The name Shabti likely means the one who will answer, as in they will answer your call in the afterlife. They tended to be quite small. They were made of many kinds of materials. In the New Kingdom period, they were placed in container boxes. A good afterlife meant you needed a servant Shabti for every day and enough overseers for each week of the year. So you can imagine there are a lot of these Shabti figurines around. But these Shabti figurines are likely not direct parallels with the teraphim. They do not have the same function. The Shabtis are submissive and the teraphim aren't. Shabtis aren't involved in consultation or oracles in the way teraphim are. Now, if the teraphim are cult idols of gods or protective spirits, then we have a fair number of examples of these. There are representations of fairly well-known deities like Baal or Asherah, but also of lesser-known or unknown deities. And from Cyprus, we even find multiple life-size terracotta figurines, though these are not representations of deities, but of wealthy patrons of shrines.
The ephod is probably the most widely known of the special priestly objects mentioned in the Old Testament. Modern depictions of ancient Israelite priests include some of them wearing ephods, so as a viewer of this channel and a reader of the Bible, you probably have some familiarity with this article of clothing. Its apparent function as a stand-in for the Ark of the Covenant, however, is probably less familiar, and it's a noteworthy alternative understanding of what an ephod was and how it was used. It seems that both the Ark and the ephod represented the presence and availability of God to God's people, though this alternative use of ephod appears to border on idolatry. What's more unusual, and perhaps more unsettling to modern readers, is the teraphim. Did the ancient Israelites really possess miniature representations of God and even other deities that were used in divinatory practices? Could the ancient Israelites even have had some sense of ancestor veneration? Doesn't this go against some fundamental Old Testament beliefs, including some of the Ten Commandments? Well, yes. At least the way that we understand them today. But I think the ephod and teraphim also give us insight into the development of Israel's belief system as a process, not a singular event. The Israelites emerged from and were surrounded by cultures that worshipped numerous gods and venerated ancestral spirits. So I don't think it's unusual to see vestiges of these beliefs still present even in the Old Testament we have today. It's highly probable that early in Israel's history, things like the worship of local deities and ancestral spirits were still practiced because that's just the way religious life worked for ancient Near Eastern people. Monolatry, the worship of only one God, and later monotheism, the belief in only one God, took time to become the dominant view within Israel. And even the canonical form of the Old Testament doesn't eliminate hints of earlier beliefs entirely. They're still there in the received traditions that make up the Old Testament we know today, although their presence seems to be incidental rather than critical to the theology of the Old Testament. Now, that's not to say that the presence of these figurines represents beliefs that go unchallenged in the Old Testament. The worship of foreign gods becomes increasingly problematic as we move from the period of the Judges to the divided kingdom and the exile. By the time of the divided kingdom of Israel, divinatory practices seem to be falling out of style in favor of classical prophecy, something we'll talk more about next week. Divination in general, and the Ephod and Teraphim in particular, became less important in discerning God's will in favor of direct communication through the prophets. The prevailing message of the Old Testament when it comes to divination seems to be, well, this is the way we used to do it, but we don't do it that way anymore. The worship of idols and any god but Yahweh is resoundingly condemned by the Old Testament's conclusion, and failure to worship Yahweh alone is directly connected to the downfall of both Israel and Judah. Now, while there once may have been a place for divinatory objects in Israelite religion, by the end of the Old Testament, that time is long gone. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a like and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.